Our next speaker is Jim Glennon. The Sack, A Family's Reflections is the title of his talk. Jim Glennon is a former TDE Senator and a member of the British and Irish Inter-Parliamentary Body. A company director and chairman, he is currently chairman of the Fingal Age Friendly Alliance. He's also a former international rugby player and a coach of Leinster Rugby. We are indebted to the kindness of Jim Glennon as he very kindly allowed us to use a photo album which his grandparents created in 1920. His grandparents were the owners of the Gladstone Inn, which is now the Gladstone Inn. And his grandparents created an album of photographs and newspaper clippings which we used extensively in our commemorative calendar. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, everybody. And before I begin, I want to particularly acknowledge the presence of Mary English and Stephanie Lawless, granddaughters of James Lawless. This is a purely personal thing before I get into my script, I often think that when we talk at the Sack of Balbriggan, there's all kinds of talk about the high profile stuff and the sexy stuff, as you might call it. But the fact is that two men lost their lives and two families were, I won't say destroyed because that's not a fair description, but they were certainly tragically affected, and not just in the immediate aftermath. It's something that certainly I have found out in my own personal way, that it trickles down in different ways into the different generations, and I think by dint of that, I just want to particularly acknowledge the presence of the two ladies. So it's an honour to be here and to talk about something which is so personal to both of you. Also, I should congratulate the officers and members of Balbriggan Historical Society on our Balbriggan and District Historical Society. My apologies. District probably doesn't include Skerries, but don't worry about it. On their perseverance and resilience in these pandemic times to successfully bring together such an outstanding group of speakers, all highly expert in their respective topics. I'm privileged to join them on my own non-expert and very personal take on an event which I believe had a major impact, as I said already, on so many lives of so many people in our community. There'll be more of this anon, but in fact I myself believe I wouldn't be here at all were it not for the Sack of Balbriggan, but I'll come back to that later. Some family background to start with. I'm the 13th of 14 grandchildren of the late Joseph McGowan and his wife Teresa, née Edwards, who were the owners and occupiers in 1920 of the Gladstone Inn, licensed premises on Drogheda Street, now extended and known as the Milestone Inn. There were 11 McGowan children in all. 3 of them sadly didn't survive childhood, and my understanding is that on the night of September the 20th, 1920, 6 of them were in the living accommodation above the licensed premises. Those 6 were Matt, Pat, who was subsequently a GP in the town for many years, Jerry, who was a solicitor in the town for many years subsequently, Bunny, who took over the family pub after my grandfather's death, Jenny, my own mother, and her younger sister May. They were all living with their parents above the premises on the night. It's interesting that my mother, when she did speak of that night, simply refused to speak of the events leading up to it, the murder of Constable Burke and the possible identity of the perpetrator. There was an omerta, and it appeared to be a family omerta. They just didn't want to talk about that, and they would talk on a very limited basis about how events occurred for them on that night. I'm sorry I've no slides, but it's just a totally personal thing. I hope to add slides, add photographs to it later before I send it for the archives. In fact, it's only in recent weeks through Jim Walsh's research that I have got any information at all on who pulled the trigger in the pub. And I think it's an indication of the way I was brought up, and which I want to talk about, that I was never encouraged and I never developed an interest in who pulled the trigger, because it didn't really matter. The fact is the Tans came into the town and did what they did. My mother's account of it, and this is very much something gathered piecemeal over a long number of years. She needed a few gin and tonics to get her to talk of the night, but what she did say, and I'm going to give it to you exactly as I have from her, she would have been 5 at the time. She told of being asleep in her room and of hearing voices at the door shouting demands for her elder brother Matt, who was active in the War of Independence. Matt wasn't in the house, he had got out, but they didn't believe that he wasn't there, and they came in and ransacked the house and pub, set fire to it, and my mother and her siblings and parents escaped over the back wall. There was a lengthy garden, which is now part of the yard of the garage in Convent Lane. That was originally a fruit garden, fruit and vegetable garden at the back of the pub. And the back wall, I remember in my time, backed onto Smith and Company. They went over that wall and stayed over that wall the night of the sack, literally watching their house go up in flames. There's a story for which I cannot vouch, but it was doing the rounds fairly strongly in the family, I know, and that is that one of the drunken Tans took either a child of Prague or a statue of the Sacred Heart, I'm not quite sure which, out of the house and put it on a windowsill across the road and stood back from it and took aim at it and was ready to press the trigger when the woman of the house, which would have been the cottage beside Landy's pub, opened the window and calmly took in the statue and walked across the road and gave it back to my grandmother at the height of the whole thing. As I say, I can't verify it, but that is a story that's there. The following morning, the family made their way to Skerries, where they lived briefly with a grand aunt of mine on the Harbour Road next door to Joe May's pub. My grandmother and Joe May's mother were sisters. The family was a seafaring family in Skerries. They had schooners in the harbour, and Joe May, the original Joe May, and my mother would have been first cousins. So they stayed there for a few weeks, the 8 of them, before they got a house a house became available in Balbriggan Street, and they settled in Balbriggan Street for 3 years while the Gladstone was being rebuilt. And 4 doors up the road, there was another pub, a lot of pubs in this story, but there was another pub. This one was owned by my paternal grandfather, James Glennon. And along the street, the kids were of very similar age. My grandfather Glennon had 5, and there were 6 McGowns, 4 doors apart. So they came together. There was a meeting of similar ages, and there were lifelong friendships forged at that time, which lasted, as I say, for their lifetimes, and brought my father to Balbriggan several years later 10 years later to play rugby for Balbriggan, and ended up another few years with my father, Frank Glennon, from Skerries, marrying my mother, Jenny McGowan, from Balbriggan. So when I say that I mightn't be here were it not for the sack, it has some resonance. I think too it's worth commenting on the irony of the name of the pub, which was the Gladstone Inn. It was named after a British Prime Minister, William Ewart Gladstone, who was Prime Minister for a total of 12 years, spread over 4 separate terms between the years 1868 and 1894. He was also Chancellor of the Exchequer for 4 separate terms too. So he was a man who pretty well dominated British politics in the second half of the 19th century. My grandfather thought that it would be a good idea to name the pub after Gladstone to show some support for him for his efforts in relation to Home Rule on Ireland's behalf. You have to remember these were the times in Ireland, we're talking the second half of the 19th century, which was post-famine and pre the real movement for Home Rule and later independence. But there's one particular speech, and if any of you are so inclined, there's one particular speech made in the House of Commons on the Home Rule for Ireland Bill. It was made on the 7th of June 1886 by Gladstone, and having read it recently, I suspect that was my grandparents' primary motivation in naming the pub. I should also emphasise at this stage, particularly in the context of the contributions of the expert historians that have gone before me, I want to say it again, mine is very much a non-expert view, but it is highly personal, and it's of the sack and its consequences, just from one particular family's perspective. And I have to say it's that my family were not particularly badly affected. When you see Clonard Street and you see the families of the men who died, we got off extremely lightly. We were back in business in 3 years, which is probably an achievement in itself, but that is the case. But as I say, I feel a bit of an imposter, to be honest with you, in that the legacy for the McGowan family was nothing like the legacy for the Lawless or Gibbons family or those families that we saw on Clonard Street. And I should also say, are the legacy for the Burke families either, the RIC men, of which I'll come to later on. I spoke about my mother's, the difficulty in getting my mother to speak about it. It was like drawing blood from a stone. And it was at a time when Irish history post-1900 wasn't being taught in our schools. I think there's a good few here in the room who will remember those days. It was deemed to be much too sensitive a topic. Literally, a lot of the wounds were still raw, and it was decided that certainly to my mind, right up into the late 1960s, possibly into 1970s, Irish history post-1900 wasn't dealt with at all on the school curricula. I think it's important to put that in context in terms of the oral, hand-me-down nature of the story as I have it. In addition to that, there were a couple of other more local issues which influenced my grasp of the history of the sack. One was the age-old Skerries-Balbriggan rivalry, and the other was the fact that my parents' marriage was what was referred to at the time as a mixed marriage. He was staunch Fianna Fáil and she was equally staunch Fine Gael. As a result, there was no politics ever discussed in the House, certainly not when the kids were around, and I suspect even when we weren't around. It just wasn't discussed. Again, to put it all in context, the daily newspaper was the Irish Independent, which to me was, looking back on it, was probably a compromise between the Irish Press and the Irish Times, either end of the spectrum. They take the one in the relative middle. And the radio news that we all got in what was a pre-television age was from both Radio Éireann and sometimes from the BBC, which wasn't an unusual situation, again, in Ireland of the 1960s. It was while RTE had been launched in 62, it hadn't, the television wasn't as all-dominating as it became until well into the 70s, because there wasn't the range of stations that could be got. I know we had a television in the pub we owned in Skerries, but we didn't have one at home till about 1970. For me, the awakening was, first of all, the Golden Jubilee commemoration in 1966 of the Easter Rising. Particularly, I remember a man, I was at school in the De La Salle in Skerries, and I remember a man literally from around the corner, about 8 doors around the corner. I live in Strand Street, he lived in Cross Street, also known as Thomas Hand Street, and he was a man called Kevin Woodcock. And Kevin Woodcock, who was a man that I had known all my life, I was 13 at this stage, but I knew him he was a man who lived down the road and always had been there. And I discovered in 1966 that Kevin Woodcock had been in Boland's Mills with Dev. And he came to the school to talk to us. I think it was, you might have been there at the time, Jim, were you? Right, well you would have been. Anyway, Kevin Woodcock came and spoke to us, and for me, it brought the whole thing really close, and I developed an interest in it. And here was this man who Dev subsequently came to his funeral, and all of a sudden there was colour beginning to fill in the pages which had only been sketched out. And then 4 years later, we had the Golden Jubilee of the sack. And this is why I'm so honoured to be here today, because it was in 1970, I had just done my leaving. I was brought into my Uncle Jerry's office to do a bit of running around and gophering for him. He and Louis Derham, his great friend, were organising the commemoration of the sack, the 50th anniversary of the sack. And it was very interesting in that it's only in retrospect that I have this, but I know that they went out of their way to keep politics totally out of it, which was a good trick in those days. They had one idea in mind, which was to commemorate rather than to celebrate, and to bring people together by their commemoration, and not to drive any wedges. This was at a very difficult time, because 1969 was the start of the Troubles in the North. And again, I would be very firmly of the view, and I think most historians agree, that the commemoration of 1966 of the Golden Jubilee of the Easter Rising was a major contributor to the awakening of the younger cohort of Catholics in Northern Ireland, which developed into the People's Democracy and into the Troubles as they started in 1969. I'm sure most of us who were here at the time clearly remember the veterans, the massed ranks of the veterans of 1916 and the War of Independence marching down Dublin Street, past the hotel into Bridge Street, and then they went on up right up to the top of Drogheda Street, where they were bussed out to Balbriggan for a mass. That mass was an outdoor mass. It took place at the gravesides of James Lawless and Sean Gibbons, and it was followed by speeches from prominent national politicians of the time. And again, it was interesting to see who the politicians were. It was cross-party. There was Sean McEntee, TD of Fianna Fáil, who was the Taoiseach at the time. There was Senator Michael O'Higgins of Fine Gael, and there was Justin Keating of Labour. But leaving aside the events at Balbriggan, there was also, what to me, in retrospect particularly, was the most significant aspect of the day, was a wreath-laying ceremony at the memorial on the bridge. And it was something that, again, in retrospect, looking back at Uncle Jerry's way of doing things and with Louis Durham, this was their project within a project, as it were. It had been generally accepted that they themselves would jointly lay the wreath on the bridge. But from an early stage in their preparations, and again in pursuance of that underlying theme of reconciliation, they had another plan which only the two of them were aware of. It was daring, but it was very much worth the effort if they could pull it off. It was by no means unusual at that time that there was a residue of animosity, indeed enmity, often of a very significant degree, lingering between the erstwhile comrades who had fought together in 1916 and in the War of Independence, but had subsequently taken opposite sides in the Civil War. And when you think about it, it's not at all difficult to imagine grudges in these circumstances lasting, sometimes unfortunately to this day, but certainly less than 50 years, which is the time span we're talking about. Hence the symbolism of the wreath being jointly laid by two old comrades who had turned protagonists and who had, let's say, demonstrated, well, they hadn't demonstrated a whole lot of mutual respect over the previous 50 years. The two involved were Christy Coyle, sorry, I'll come to that in a second. The two involved were Christy Coyle and Jack the Munchie Gaynor. And they were the targets for Louis and Jerry from the start. When they set out to commemorate the event, they were the start. And we have there Louis and Jerry bringing the wreath forward, but it was, and we have Paddy Burke, which a lot of us will remember in the background. I don't see too many others that I can recall, but that's Jerry and Louis bringing the wreath forward, and it was placed at the memorial by Jack Gaynor and Christy Coyle. That was the major project of the two men. Again, it was an attempt when there were breaks and fractures emerging all over Northern Ireland. They were determined that their ceremony wasn't, and their commemoration wasn't in any way going to be in any way divisive. And looking back at it all now, and looking back at the family's perspective, the naming of the pub, which in itself was a very brave act in 19th century Ireland, Matt McGowan's participation in the war, the burning of the pub, and then its rapid reconstruction to full return less than 3 years later, all indicate a deep strength of character on the part of my grandparents. And I have to say that, again, in those days we tend to think of the male being the absolute dominant part of any family. Ours was slightly different in that my grandmother, I never met my grandfather, but I did know my grandmother reasonably well. I was 15 when she died. She was a formidable woman, and she was very much an equal partner in the business and in everything to do with the family. On the theme of reconciliation and the total absence of bitterness of any kind that I could become aware of I'm not saying there wasn't bitterness somewhere in the family. Matt McGowan eventually had to leave to go to the States, more or less on the run. He didn't come home for almost 50 years, and the only reason he came home, the reason why he hadn't come home was that he was afraid to, because he felt the old wounds were still too raw. And he came home in 1961 for the first time, and only then, because his eldest son was due to be ordained as a priest the following year, and the son wanted to come to Ireland for his ordination present. He wanted to meet his family. And my uncle Matt came home a year in advance to knock around Balbriggan for a few weeks and to make sure it was safe. I'm not saying that was in any way justified, but I'm just saying that was his perspective almost 40 years on. That was 1961. The theme of reconciliation, as I say, was there right through everything that I can see in my family's experience, and again, I say limited experience and limited victimhood of the sack. And I was thinking recently, a few months ago, reconciliation, where are we? What can be done? And I made a few inquiries in relation to the current situation of the Burke family. The two RIC men who lost their lives. And I traced them, and I traced their family, and in fact it turned out that a cousin of theirs, a distant cousin, is a very good friend of mine, which I didn't know at the time. All I knew is that he was from a particular part of the country. I asked him, was there any coincidence? And he didn't know about the RIC men because they had been literally shut out of everybody else's life within the family. And I began to dig a bit deeper, and I got him to do a little bit of digging. And obviously, age, and we're talking 100 years ago now, there is one surviving nephew of the two men still alive, but he's very elderly. But the next generation I was able to make not direct contact with, but very good, reliable contact with. And they were absolutely delighted to hear that there was an inquiry, and that the inquiry was one of goodwill rather than any kind of malevolence. Hopefully at some stage in the future, some members of the Burke family will come to Balbriggan. We didn't have the time for it, particularly with the pandemic. I suspect it was certainly looking at the time as if they would be here this weekend, but sadly that wasn't to be. It would have been wonderful, in my view, to have them there, to continue what I believe to be the important task of reconciliation. Not so much in Balbriggan. Balbriggan, these wounds have been well healed now, but I think there's reconciliation to be done 55 or 60 miles up the road, and there's reconciliation to be done everywhere. I'd just like to finish, if I may, by, again, at the risk of repetition, paying due acknowledgement to the Lawless and Gibbons families, to the people in Clonard Street who were so badly affected. Every time I look at that photograph of the Costellos, and it's in my grandmother's family album, and when we open it, anybody I show it to, that's the one that immediately catches the eye, because it's not obvious from the screen today, but none of them are wearing shoes. And it is just a picture of such desolation that you wonder how people could come back from that. An awful lot of people suffered, and undoubtedly that suffering didn't end in the immediate aftermath. It was, as these things do, they're passed down the generations. But I just finish, if I may, by dedicating this objective and somewhat distant, possibly, reflection on how the sack affected one family, but as I say, in no means were we badly affected by comparison to the others. But I want to dedicate it to the memory of Matt McGowan's eldest son, who was my grandparents' eldest grandson, and who died on Tuesday of this week in New Jersey, aged 84. He was a regular visitor to Balbriggan. He was a divil for the history. His father never told him why he left Ireland. He knew absolutely nothing about the sack until he came with his father to Balbriggan, having been ordained in 1962, and he was completely blown away by everybody asking him about what his father had told him about why he had left Ireland and all the rest of it. And the poor devil knew absolutely nothing about the sack. And he had as much trouble getting information from his parents as I had from mine. So sadly, as I say, after a long illness, he died coincidentally only this week. And as I say, I'd like to dedicate it to him, and particularly to the Lawless and Gibbons families. And finally, if I may, I hope I have my quote here. I do. I just want to conclude with some words from the late, great John Hume, the great peacemaker of our time, and it's very simple and it's brief. And he says, when people are divided, the only solution is by agreement. And with that, I leave you. I thank you for the invitation and for listening to me. Stay safe. Agus fan Cormac.